The courtroom was suffocatingly silent. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not even the scratch of a pen against paper. Every person in that grand chamber was frozen, suspended in the weight of the moment. A loud bang echoed through the courtroom as the heavy wooden doors burst open. A uniformed officer stormed in, gripping a sealed envelope with the official seal of the Department of Justice. His face was pale, his breath labored. "Your Honor, this is urgent." His voice carried a sharp edge, slicing through the eerie silence. Judge Judy Scheindlin, the legendary no-nonsense judge, narrowed her eyes as she extended her hand for the document. She ripped open the envelope, scanning the first few lines. The color drained from her face. A murmur swept across the courtroom like a slow-building storm. Lawyers whispered. Journalists fumbled with their pens. Spectators leaned forward. But Emily Taylor, the 16-year-old high school student standing at the plaintiff's podium, didn't move. She felt the shift in energy. She sensed the change in the air. And deep down she knew something had just detonated in this trial. Judge Judy looked up, her voice grave. "This case," she hesitated. Then, with a firm slam of her gavel, she continued, "is no longer just about school admissions." The room erupted into chaos. Emily's breath caught. What did that mean? Her father clenched his jaw in the front row. Ben Crump, the school board's powerful attorney, shot up from his seat, flipping through his papers as if trying to prepare for an unexpected war. Judge Judy lifted the document, tapping it against her desk. She turned her gaze directly to Emily. "Miss Taylor," she said, her voice steady but laced with something Emily couldn't quite place. Concern? Admiration? Warning? You might have just exposed something far bigger than you realize. Emily swallowed hard. What had she just walked into? Before we go further, tell us where you're watching from. If you believe in justice and truth, hit like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. 6 months earlier? Emily Taylor never thought she'd step inside a courtroom, let alone stand in one, let alone fight a case that would change everything. Back then, she was just a normal high school student in Willow Creek, California, top of her class but invisible in a crowd, a girl who spent more time solving math problems than arguing with adults. Her world was small: school, basketball practice, late-night study sessions. But then, one night, everything changed. Her father, David Taylor, a seasoned civil rights attorney, walked through the front door of their house looking defeated. He tossed his briefcase onto the kitchen table and sank into a chair, rubbing his temples. Emily noticed immediately. Her father never looked tired, never looked beaten. "Rough day?" she asked, setting a plate of lasagna in front of him. David sighed, shaking his head. "You could say that." Emily pulled out a chair. "What happened?" Her father hesitated, then sighed again. "There's a girl in Riverside County, bright, determined, wants to be a doctor someday." He picked up his fork but didn't eat. "But she just got kicked out of school," Emily frowned. "Why?" David exhaled sharply. "A technicality." She waited for him to continue. "Her parents couldn't afford to move into the right district. She was supposed to transfer, but instead of helping, the school board shut the door in her face." Emily's stomach twisted. "That's not fair." Her father nodded. "It's not." "So, you're helping them, right?" He nodded again. "Pro bono, but the school board has deep pockets. Their lawyers filed a motion to bury the case before it even starts." Emily's jaw tightened. "That's legal?" "Not legal, just effective." Something hot burned in Emily's chest. She wasn't a lawyer, but even she knew, if the system was built to help kids, why did it seem designed to keep them out? She watched her father struggle over the next few weeks. The case drained him. Long nights, endless phone calls, doors slammed in his face. Then, one night, Emily found it. She was sitting in her father's office, flipping through one of his old law books. The pages smelled of dust and ink, their edges worn from years of use. And then she saw it, a Supreme Court case from decades ago, a precedent, a case that changed the entire legal landscape of education rights. And suddenly, an idea formed. It was crazy, outrageous, impossible. But it was also exactly what they needed. That night, when her father came home, Emily blurted it out before she could lose her nerve. "What if I argue the case?" Her father froze mid-step, his tie half untied. "What?" Emily's words tumbled out, rushed, nervous, unstoppable. "You always say the law belongs to everyone, that it's about standing up for what's right, no matter who you are. So why can't I stand up for this girl?" David's expression shifted from shock to concern to something unreadable. Then he shook his head. "Emily, it's not that simple." "Why not?" "Because courtrooms aren't high school debates." He set down his briefcase. "They'll tear you apart." Emily stood her ground. "Not if I'm prepared." Her father sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Then he looked at her, really looked at her, and he saw something he hadn't expected. Fire, determination, a fight she wasn't going to walk away from. "You're serious about this?" "Dead serious." A long silence. Then, finally, David Taylor exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Then we better get to work." For the next 3 months, Emily Taylor became obsessed. She traded basketball practice for law books, movie nights for legal debates, and weekends for hours of courtroom simulations. Every day she sat across from her father at the dining room table, turning it into a makeshift courtroom. "Your Honor, my client has been denied her constitutional right to an education." David cut her off instantly, slamming his palm on the table. "Overruled. Where is your precedent? Show me your case law. Cite your sources." "Again," Emily sighed, flipping through her notes, her highlighter-streaked pages feeling endless. Her father wasn't going easy on her, he couldn't afford to, because once she stepped into that real courtroom, no one would. At school, her friends noticed the change. "You missed lunch again, Em. What's going on? Why are you reading law books in the cafeteria? You do know you're not actually a lawyer, right?" Emily ignored the whispers. She wasn't doing this for extra credit. She wasn't doing this for attention. She was doing this because someone had to. It started as a small article in the local newspaper. High school students prepare to challenge the school board in court. Then the headline spread. 16-year-old to argue landmark education case against top attorneys. And suddenly, Emily Taylor wasn't just a student anymore. She was a symbol, a kid taking on a broken system, a girl challenging the rules that were built to keep her quiet. At first, the school board ignored her. Then, when the media wouldn't stop covering the story, they laughed. Then, when Emily refused to back down, they got scared. They hired Ben Crump, a legal powerhouse known for his sharp cross-examinations and ruthless courtroom tactics. A man who didn't lose. "They're bringing in Ben Crump?" Emily asked her father, wide-eyed. David nodded. "They're taking you seriously now." Emily swallowed hard. This just got real. Emily sat alone in her room, staring at her notes. Her hands trembled as she reached for her mother's old locket, the only thing she had left of her. Her mother had died 3 years ago, a fierce advocate for education rights. Emily wished she could hear her voice one more time, to tell her she was doing the right thing, to tell her she wasn't crazy for believing in something bigger than herself. A soft knock at her door. Her father stepped inside, holding 2 mugs of hot cocoa. "Can't sleep?" Emily shook her head. Her father set a mug in front of her, then sat on the bed. "You're ready, Em." She let out a small, nervous laugh. "Am I?" He nodded. "You remind me of your mom." Emily's throat tightened. "She'd be proud of you." Emily blinked back the stinging in her eyes. She picked up her cocoa, taking a small sip. Then, in a quiet voice, she whispered, "I just want to make her proud." Her father smiled. "You already did." Emily stood outside the courthouse, staring at the massive building that would decide everything. The doors loomed high, the weight of the moment sinking in. Reporters crowded the steps, their cameras clicking as soon as they saw her. She took a deep breath. Her father's hand rested on her shoulder. "You ready?" Emily nodded. She wasn't just walking into a courtroom. She was walking into history. The double doors swung open, and Emily stepped into the grand courtroom, her heart hammering in her chest. Rows of dark wooden benches stretched toward the judge's bench, filled with reporters, legal experts, and silent onlookers. Cameras flashed. The low hum of murmurs buzzed in the air. At the front, Judge Judy Scheindlin sat in her high-backed chair, her sharp eyes flicking toward Emily as if sizing her up. To her left, Ben Crump, the powerhouse attorney for the school board, sat with a stack of legal documents in front of him, his expression unreadable. Emily gripped the folder in her hands, willing herself to focus. This was it. No more practice, no more prep. It was time. Judge Judy adjusted her glasses and spoke. "All right," she said, voice calm but firm. "We have a rather unusual situation here today." She glanced at Emily. "I assume, Miss Taylor, you understand that this courtroom is not a high school debate tournament?" A few chuckles rippled through the room. Emily kept her face neutral. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Judy nodded, then turned toward Ben Crump. "Mr. Crump, I imagine you have a few objections before we begin?" Ben Crump stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is an insult to the integrity of this courtroom." Emily felt her stomach tighten. This young lady, no matter how well-intentioned, Crump gestured toward her, is not a lawyer. She has no formal training, no degree, and no business standing before this bench arguing constitutional law. The murmurs grew louder. Some nodded in agreement. Others whispered. Emily forced herself to stay still, waiting. Judge Judy leaned forward, her fingers steepled. "Let me ask you this, Mr. Crump. Would you say that the law belongs to everyone?" Crump hesitated. "Yes, Your Honor, but—" "And," Judge Judy continued, cutting him off, "if a citizen, regardless of their age, can present a well-reasoned argument supported by legal precedent, do they not have the right to be heard in this courtroom?" Crump clenched his jaw. "That's not the point." "That's exactly the point, Mr. Crump," Judge Judy said sharply. "And since I make the rules in this courtroom, I say we hear Miss Taylor out." She turned to Emily. "Make your case." A wave of silence fell over the room. Emily swallowed her nerves, and then she began. She took a deep breath, steadying her voice. "Your Honor, this case isn't just about one girl being denied an education. It's about the legal precedent that allows school boards to selectively enforce policies and how those policies disproportionately harm certain students." Ben Crump sighed, leaning back in his chair, already prepared to tear her apart. Emily continued, her voice gaining strength. "The Constitution guarantees equal protection under the law, but what happens when school boards twist that law to maintain an unequal system?" She stepped forward slightly. "If we allow this decision to stand, we are telling every student in America that their right to education is conditional, that their future is not based on merit, but on arbitrary technicalities designed to keep them out." A pause. The courtroom was dead silent. Even Judge Judy's expression had shifted, less skeptical, more intrigued. Emily pressed on. "But here's the real problem," she said. "This isn't just an isolated case." She reached into her folder, pulled out a document, and held it up. "This," she said, "is evidence that multiple schools have been using the same technicality to exclude students from certain districts. This isn't a fluke. It's a pattern." Judge Judy's eyebrows lifted slightly. Ben Crump, however, remained motionless. Emily could feel it now. The room was shifting. People were listening. But then the doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. A man in a dark suit strode in, his face pale. He whispered something to the court clerk, who nodded gravely and approached the judge. Judge Judy took the note, read it, and frowned. She turned back to the courtroom, her voice firm. "This court will recess while I review this development." She slammed her gavel down. Chaos erupted. Emily's stomach churned. What just happened? Her father stood up from the front row, looking confused. Ben Crump flipped through his notes as if expecting something. Emily barely heard the reporters shouting questions. She turned to her father. "Dad," she whispered. "What's going on?" He exhaled. "I don't know." But Emily could tell by the look in his eyes. Whatever was happening, it was big. The courtroom had barely cleared before Emily found herself being pulled into a side hallway by her father and Stephanie Grant, the Department of Justice lawyer who had been quietly observing the trial. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. "Someone tell me what's happening." Stephanie lowered her voice. "The DOJ has just opened an official investigation into the school board. They have evidence that this isn't just one case. There's a statewide pattern of schools deliberately excluding students from underprivileged backgrounds." Emily's breath caught. "Wait, this means we're right?" Her father ran a hand down his face, still processing. "It means we might be in a lot more danger than we thought." Stephanie nodded grimly. "Emily, listen to me. You've shaken something loose. The school board, the lobbyists, they're panicking, and when people in power panic, they fight back." Emily felt a chill crawl down her spine. Before she could respond, a court officer stepped into the hallway. "Miss Taylor?" Emily turned. The officer held out a small envelope. "No return address. This was left for you." Emily hesitated, then slowly took the envelope. Her father stepped closer. "Emily, maybe I should—" But Emily had already torn it open. Inside was a single piece of paper, typed, cold, and terrifying. "If you know what's good for you, you'll drop this case. This isn't a fight you can win." Emily's fingers trembled. Her father snatched the note from her hands, his jaw tightening. Stephanie swore under her breath. "We need to go to the police." Emily, however, was done being afraid. She lifted her chin, steel settling in her voice. We need to win." By morning, the story had exploded. Every major news outlet was covering it. High school student facing threats after taking school board to court. DOJ investigation uncovers systemic discrimination in public schools. Powerful lobbyists tied to education policy under scrutiny. Emily's face was everywhere, from television screens to viral Twitter threads. Her phone buzzed constantly. Some messages were supportive. "You're a hero. Keep fighting." "You're standing up for all of us, but others, you're ruining lives." "Drop the case before you regret it." "Watch your back." Emily felt the weight of it all pressing down on her, but she refused to stop now. The next day, the courtroom was even more packed than before. Judge Judy took her seat, expression unreadable. Ben Crump rose immediately. "Your Honor," he began, his tone measured but firm. "The defense moves to dismiss this case on the grounds that Miss Taylor is not a licensed attorney and therefore unqualified to argue in this courtroom." Emily's stomach clenched. This was their move. Discredit her, remove her, shut her down. Judge Judy turned to Emily. "Miss Taylor, how do you respond?" Emily stood, forcing her voice to stay calm. "Your Honor, I am not claiming to be a lawyer, but the law belongs to everyone, and I have the legal right to present evidence in a case that affects thousands of students." She stepped forward. "And if the defense is so confident that I'm wrong, why are they trying so hard to silence me?" A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Judge Judy's lip twitched, not quite a smile, but close. She turned back to Crump. "Motion denied." The courtroom erupted. Emily felt a rush of adrenaline. She was still in the fight. But she knew the worst was yet to come. Emily barely had time to process her small victory before the defense struck again. Ben Crump didn't waste a second. He stood, straightened his suit, and turned to the judge with an air of calm calculation. "Your Honor, the defense calls a witness." The air in the courtroom shifted. People sat up straighter, the tension thickening. Emily glanced at her father, whose jaw tightened. They hadn't been warned about a witness. Judge Judy adjusted her glasses. Proceed. The side door to the courtroom opened, and a man walked in. He was tall and thin, wearing a crisp navy suit, his expression unreadable. But Emily recognized him from the news. James Collier, a well-connected lobbyist with deep ties to education policy. A man whose influence reached lawmakers and school boards across the country. Emily's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a legal fight anymore. They had brought in a political weapon. Collier took the stand, smoothing his tie as he sat down. He looked completely at ease, as if he had already won before saying a word. Ben Crump stepped forward. Mr. Collier, can you tell the court about your involvement with the Department of Justice's investigation into this case? Collier folded his hands. Of course. His voice was smooth, polished. I was approached by certain individuals within the DOJ early on. It became clear to me that this case is less about justice and more about a political agenda. There are powerful forces trying to paint public schools as discriminatory, even when the data says otherwise. A murmur rippled through the audience. Emily's hands clenched into fists. Crump nodded as if that was exactly the answer he expected. So you're saying this case isn't about one student's rights at all? Collier sighed dramatically. I'm saying this case is being used as a tool to push a broader narrative, one that isn't necessarily based on truth. Emily's pulse pounded. She turned to Stephanie, who was furiously scribbling notes. They had to counter this, and fast. Judge Judy tilted her head. Miss Grant, do you have any questions for the witness? Stephanie stood immediately. I do, Your Honor. She approached the stand, her expression controlled but sharp. Mr. Collier, you claim to have insight into the DOJ's motivations. Are you, in fact, employed by the Department of Justice? Collier hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. No, I am not. So your knowledge is second-hand at best? Collier shifted slightly. I have connections, but no direct involvement. Stephanie cut him off smoothly. You're a lobbyist, correct? Yes. And in your lobbying career, have you ever worked for or received funding from organizations connected to private education initiatives? Collier's jaw tensed. I fail to see how that's relevant. Stephanie turned to the judge. Your Honor, Mr. Collier's testimony is an attempt to discredit this case by suggesting a political motive. However, the reality is that he himself has a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. He has worked for organizations that benefit from limiting access to public education. Judge Judy glanced at Collier, whose confident facade had cracked slightly. Crump stood again. Objection! Miss Grant is attacking the credibility of a witness without evidence. Stephanie pulled a folder from her bag. Your Honor, we have documentation showing that Mr. Collier has received financial backing from multiple groups that have actively lobbied against school reform. I'd like to submit this to the court. Judge Judy took the folder, flipping through the pages. After a long pause, she nodded. This court will review these documents. In the meantime, the witness's testimony will be taken with appropriate scrutiny. Collier's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Emily let out a slow breath. They had deflected the worst of it, but she could feel it in her bones. This wasn't over. As court adjourned for the day, Emily and her father walked toward the exit, but just before they reached the door, a voice stopped them. You don't know what you're getting into, kid. Emily turned. James Collier stood just a few feet away, his polished demeanor still in place, but his eyes darker now. Emily squared her shoulders. I know exactly what I'm getting into. Collier chuckled, shaking his head. You think you've won something today? That judge might humor you for now, but this world doesn't change because of high school speeches. You're out of your depth. Emily held his gaze. If that were true, you wouldn't be trying so hard to stop me." For the first time, Collier's mask slipped, just for a second. Then, with a smirk, he turned and walked away. Her father put a reassuring hand on her back. "Come on, Em." As they stepped outside, cameras flashed. Reporters shouted her name. Emily inhaled the cool evening air, steadying herself. She wasn't just in a courtroom battle anymore. She was in a war. The courtroom was packed tighter than ever. Reporters crammed into every available seat, cameras lined the back wall, and the tension in the air felt like a storm waiting to break. The case had escalated beyond anyone's expectations. This wasn't just about one girl being denied admission anymore. It was about corruption at the highest levels of the education system. The world was watching. Emily sat at the plaintiff's table, her fingers gripping the edges of her notes. She had spent the entire night preparing, going over every argument, anticipating every possible counter from Ben Crump and the school board's legal team. But the stakes had changed. They had called in a lobbyist to discredit her. They had issued threats. They had tried to get the case thrown out, and now she could feel their desperation. Judge Judy took her seat, rapping her gavel once. "Let's get on with it. Miss Taylor, the floor is yours." Emily stood, her legs steady despite the weight pressing down on her. She scanned the room, seeing her father in the front row, Stephanie Grant seated just behind her, and the opposing attorneys watching her with carefully concealed disdain. She could see the doubt in some eyes, but she also saw something else: curiosity. She took a deep breath and began. "Your Honor, in the last few days, we have heard argument after argument claiming that this case is an isolated incident, that my client's rejection from her school was simply an administrative technicality, that there is no larger problem." She turned to face the jury. "But I'm here to prove that's a lie." She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder, the one piece of evidence she had been saving for this moment. She stepped forward, handing it to the court clerk, who passed it up to Judge Judy. "These are internal communications between school administrators, education lobbyists, and state officials. They show a coordinated effort to block certain students from accessing quality education. Emails, memos, even handwritten notes, all detailing how school boards across multiple districts have been quietly manipulating policies to keep low-income students out of higher-performing schools." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even Ben Crump looked momentarily taken aback. Emily pressed on. "Miss Grant and her team at the Department of Justice obtained these documents as part of their federal investigation, and they prove beyond any doubt that my client's case is not unique. It is part of a systemic effort to maintain educational inequality." Judge Judy flipped through the pages, her expression darkening. Ben Crump stood, his face unreadable. "Your Honor, we were not made aware of these documents before today." Judge Judy turned to him. "That's because the DOJ had to verify their authenticity before entering them into the record." Crump nodded, shifting tactics. "Even if these documents are real, they do not prove that the school board acted with intent in this specific case. Correlation is not causation." Emily turned to him. "Then let's hear from someone who was a part of it." The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a woman stepped inside. A hush fell over the room as she walked toward the witness stand. She was middle-aged, dressed conservatively, her face tight with nerves. Stephanie Grant stood. "Your Honor, we call to the stand Rebecca Langley, former administrative coordinator for the Riverside County School Board." Ben Crump's eyes flashed with recognition, and for the first time he looked genuinely concerned. Judge Judy nodded. "Proceed." Rebecca took a deep breath and looked toward Emily before speaking. "I worked for the school board for 15 years, and in that time I saw decisions being made that I knew weren't right. I was told to push applications from certain neighborhoods to the bottom of the pile. I was instructed to mark students as ineligible based on technicalities that had never been enforced before. I watched as high-performing schools were kept inaccessible to the kids who needed them most. She hesitated before continuing, her voice thick with emotion. I stayed quiet because I thought I had to. But when I saw what they were doing to this girl, when I saw that they were willing to threaten a teenager just to keep their secret, I couldn't stay silent anymore. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Emily locked eyes with Ben Crump. Still think this case is about one student? Crump said nothing. Judge Judy took off her glasses, rubbing her temples. Let's cut to the chase. Mr. Crump, do you have anything to say before I make my ruling? Crump hesitated, then let out a long breath. No, Your Honor. Judge Judy sat forward, her expression firm. Good. Then here's my decision. The courtroom fell silent. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff. The school board's actions were not only unethical, but illegal. Effective immediately, the plaintiff will be reinstated, and the Department of Justice will proceed with a full investigation into the broader implications of this case. The room exploded. Reporters scrambled for their phones, people gasped, and Emily felt a wave of relief crash over her. She had done it. Judge Judy slammed her gavel once more. Court is adjourned. Emily turned to her father, who pulled her into a tight hug. I'm so proud of you, Em. Stephanie clapped her on the back. You just changed everything. As they stepped outside, the courthouse steps were flooded with reporters. Microphones were shoved toward her, cameras flashed, voices shouted questions. Emily took a deep breath and looked at them all. This case was never about me, she said. It was about fairness, about making sure every kid has the same shot at a good education. And today, we proved that no matter how powerful they are, no one is above the law. The crowd erupted into cheers. That night, Emily sat on the porch with her father, the stars stretching wide above them. You did it? He said quietly. Emily smiled, her mother's locket warm against her skin. No, she whispered. We did.